Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Today's video is a review on the new EP by Carl Finlow, called Terminus EP. Carl Finlow is an electro producer from the UK. He records mainly electro under his name and also the name Silicon Scally, and then also Voice Stealer, and then he also records Deep House under the name Random Factor. Those are his main four uh, names that he records under. Generally, the music under his real name is a little bit more traditional and futuristic, sort of blend of electro. He kind of toes the balance between maybe a vintage style of electro beats and then generally a little bit of sci-fi, a little bit of futurism in there, and definitely next level electro, but maybe not as sci-fi as the stuff I've heard under Silicon Scally. I've been a big fan of Carl Finlow's for almost 25 years now. I first discovered him with his Electro trilogy records in I think it was 2001, 2002 on Device, and just loved those records. And then I ended up buying his old Silicon Scally releases up to that point, and then all through the 2000s and 2010s. Um, also going back to his voice stealer work, and I actually did know his stuff by Random Factor a little bit earlier than 2002, 2001, but I didn't know it was the same artist until I went to Discogs, at that time and discovered it was the same artist. But I've been a big fan of Carl Finlow's for a long time now, and he's going on, I think, roughly about 30 years recording, and I got a chance to see that he was coming out with a new EP, so I wanted to check it out and review it here today for you guys. Really excited to check these out. I collect a lot of his work, and I'm a big fan of his work, and there's really, probably a handful of electro producers that I buy on the spot without even hearing them before. I can think of like Drexia was always like that, ARPANET, ERP is always like that, Morphology, VersaLife, Dynarec, Signal. Those are just a handful of producers that do electro that I buy on the spot because they do such a great job. But definitely Carl Finlow's in that upper tier of my favorite electro producers, and not just over a few releases, but over 30 years now of pretty much doing electro since his first Voice Stealer stuff, and I've been a real big fan of his works, and his track called "Evaluation" is probably in my top five electro tracks of all time. You can hear in his music, he definitely has a background in electro, but also a background in, I don't know if I'd say new wave, although I'm sure there's some new wave in there, but you know, there's a there's a sort of a dramatic element to a lot of his music that, especially under like Silicon Scally, where it almost like it toes the line between techno and electro, but also there's such a dramatic, and depending on the BPMs, there's almost like, I don't know if I'd say a Italo disco influence in there too, but there's such a dramatic and futuristic sound in there. It almost transcends uh, maybe an industrial background or new wave, or it seems like this, or even new wave. It seems like there's a little bit more of a background of vintage electro, but also being open to house music and just the future styles of music, probably in the 80s and 90s as he grew up and started doing music. That's what I feel from his music. But there's something in his music that's just a little bit different than a lot of electro producers. And if you don't know his music, maybe you'll get a taste of that as we hear the four tracks on here. But yeah, let's go on to hear the EP in its full, starting out with a title track called Terminus. All right, let's check it out. title track called Terminus. Wow, what a killer track that is. It definitely reminds me of the electrology, uh, series that he did in the early 2000s. It definitely has the more. This has a little bit more of a Silicon Scally sound for me. It's right in the balance of the two, but certainly this one is a little bit more sci-fi, and so sometimes I think of more sci-fi as under Silicon Scally, but just a killer track. And there's such a sci-fi element and like a dystopian kind of end of the world, dramatic kind of sound in here, and the tension builds. And one of the great things although the tension builds, it's still like it flows really nicely, and it's such a smooth track, such a deep bass line, and sometimes he throws in a little bit of acid lines in there. And the great thing about his tracks, and I've seen videos of him playing live over the years, and he always has such a live feel for his tracks. And it's stuff that he does play live, and because of that, it's just they have such a his tracks don't really have as a studio. um I don't know if I'd say studio centric, or maybe overly studio processed, where it's maybe a little bit stale sometimes because it's so thought through. And like you can hear like it feels more like a live jam, is I guess is what I'm saying. And one of the great things I like about what Carl Finlow does in his grooves is a lot of times techno and electro, and there's certain genres that can be kind of stale. And one of the things I notice about electro particularly is like the first time you hear a track, like sometimes the beat can really take you with electro, and then you're like, wow, that beat is sick. But over the course of listening to it multiple times and years, that kind of wears off. Like you need something more than just a beat with electro. For me, I mean, of course, there's tracks that are pretty much just a beat, and they're still classic. You can think of like certain beats and things like Planet Rock or Tibetan Jam, or there's a lot of electro tracks that are with just a beat. But what makes them even better is they're a full track, and they do a lot more. And the thing that I really like about Carl Finlow's music is he calls what he does what I call accents in his rhythms, whether it be a shaker, or maybe it's an acid line, or maybe he comes back like in this track towards the end, and there's sort of a period where not necessarily the tension kind of comes down a little bit, and it's towards the later, and he has a different sort of sound on that melody part that wasn't in the original part. So even though a lot of electro producers, especially more vintage ones, like ones that went through the '90s and grew up through the '80s and started making music in the '90s, like Carl did, a lot of them, a lot of their electro beats sort of stay the same through the track, and there's really not that much that changes. Where you can see in this track, like you can hear in this track how there's so many little accents and so many little sound effects that flow in such a creative way, and always ever changing and flowing, and it just makes it constantly engaging. And as it morphs, there's so many things that morph along with it at different levels and different speeds, and such a great track. But this track really reminds me of like Anomaly and Odyssey, some of my favorite early Carl Finlow tracks, from when I first got into his music. And this track is verging on. I mean, it's definitely a excellent track for me. It's verging on legendary track just from the first couple listens. I had to listen to it a couple times because it's so good. It's one of those tracks that you know uh, it's hard to quite put a well, it's not that hard actually to put a score on it, because it sounds like what I've loved about his music for 20 25 years now. So I have no qualms and no reserve in saying that I give the score an 8 and 3/4 out of 10. it's right on the borderline of being a legendary track for me. It's definitely an excellent track, well above 8, and could easily be in the nines. Um, with further listens, but it's already right there. Great. All right, so that was track number 2 called Phalanx. I believe that's how you pronounce it. This is certainly the um, definitely has like a robotic funk to it. There's um, such a good groove in here. It's definitely an ass shaker. That kind of track that you kind of want to hear on a dance floor, and it's just so sick. You know, such a sick groove. It's this track so far. This EP sounds very digital sounding, and that is um, very Silicon Scally, Carl Finlow. Like over the years has gone by, his tracks seem a little bit more digital, and I'm a big analog fan, and it doesn't really matter so much with his music because it's still so good. It doesn't really like. I don't ever hear myself saying, "Oh, I wish it was more analog sounding. I wish it was a little bit less crunchy." Like a lot of times with Carl Finlow's music, it's so futuristic and so alien sounding and so sci-fi sometimes that it works better with digital. And it's just so well produced. It doesn't really make me say, "Oh, I wish it was more analog sounding," or this or that. It's just he just does his thing, and it works, of course, because I'm a big fan. But this one sounds very alien sounding, with the swirling melody, and the bass line really grows as the track goes on. Just really nasty, gritty, kind of almost distorted bass line at points. Just kind of, and there's almost like a melody that comes out of the bass line too, which is really cool. And then around like 3 minutes and 45 seconds, the beat kind of almost has a little bit of a bridge to it, and the melody, a different melody comes out and sort of balances out the track sort of in the middle of it, and then it kind of carries on through the rest of the robotic funk, and really sick track, really good stuff. Another very good track for sure on this one, 7.5 out of 10. Strong track, really good side right there. Those 2 tracks in a row. You definitely have the powerful first one that just is an attention getter and just super sci-fi, and then this one's a little bit more funky and a little bit more in a groove, but still has some some futuristic melodies and a lot of futurism in the track. And let's go on to track number 3 called Gone. so that was the third track, or the first track on the second side, called Gonk. Definitely another alien sounding, very busy track. It almost sounds like you blended the first. If you blended the first two rhythms together from the first two tracks, it would almost sort of sound like this. It almost doesn't know which way it's gonna go. Like, is it gonna go faster? Is it gonna go more in line with the first track, or is it going to be more raw and sort of a deeper sort of electro groove? It's kind of blending techno and electro in almost like a battle. It almost sounds like they're conflicted which way it's going to go, and out of that, it just sounds really cool. Lots of futuristic sounds. A lot of growl on the bass line, really sick. The beat at like 4 minutes and 2 seconds has a little bit of a Kraftwerk numbers sort of sound to me, and I love the beat at the end, the last couple bars, maybe the last 4 bars or so. Love the last 30 seconds, that little electro beat, and I got the track at 6 3/4 stars, right on the verge of good and very good. Um, don't like it as much as the first two tracks, but it's just more of a preference thing. Probably this one's doesn't really have the melody that I look for, like in the first couple tracks. So it's going to be hard for this one to be as good rated as those other two, because those kind of combine everything. Where this one's more of a groove track, which is successful at it still, and there's some really good parts of it I like as well. Just not quite at the level of the first two tracks, in my opinion. And let's go on to the last track called Syncussion. All right, so that was the last track called Concussion. Um, Carl Finlow always does a great job of filling in the rhythm. Um, there's always so much going on. There's never the, and most of the time, there's always something being introduced or something being placed in a certain part of the rhythm. It just seems like there's always something to like grab your attention or to focus on, and there's almost two ways to like listen to like some of these tracks. Is like you just let it sink in, or you like listen really intently and listen to the certain parts of the rhythm and see how they evolve and try to focus on things that kind of come and go. There's almost two ways to listen to it, and that's great because that just lends um, to the depth of the track, and also you're wanting to listen to it more and more, and over the multiple listens over the years and everything like that, you're still almost discovering new things about the music, and that's great, especially when you're going with something so sci-fi here and futuristic and next level. This track might be the maybe most underrated track on here to some listeners. Really great combination of a very busy track. It almost sounds like aliens are talking to each other or robots are sort of talking to each other at the beginning. There's like some like time warping sounds and like some other kind of robot sort of sounding uh, parts, and then there's some melody in there, and it's just there's so much going on, and then in the second half is a little bit more of a rhythm being focused on, and it's sort of catching up with itself, and I really like that period as well. It almost sounds like there's two parts of the track, and it still kind of doesn't necessarily go back to what was like super busy, but it's still kind of I would say slowly kind of slows down, but it's maybe a little less busier as the track goes on, and Um, so in that way, it's kind of a cool track to like mix because it's so busy in the beginning, and then you have something to really mix out of and towards the end. But another really strong track. I give it a 7.25 stars out of 10. As a very good score on that track again. And let's look at the overall. I got 30 stars and a quarter divided by four tracks is a 75.6. So I round that up to a 76 out of 100, and for the score of a very good. It's verging on could getting close to the 80s. Probably maybe maybe a track away. It's right on the verge. Um, I listen to a lot of Carl Finlow tracks, so and I have a lot of his music, so I wouldn't say I'm necessarily numb to how good a quality his tracks are. So I don't feel like I'm marking them a little bit low. But this is definitely in between very good and classic. I feel like right in between 70s and 80s, and that's where I have it scored. So I mean that makes sense for how I scored it. So for me in my mind, as far as in a in a conversational piece, what do you think of that EP? I would say, oh, it's very good, verging on classic, and so I feel like the score represents that. But definitely another great track by Carl Finlow. If you're interested in buying this, this came out on Fanzine Records out of Spain, and it's available on digital and vinyl. You can also get it on Carl Finlow's Bandcamp page, which I'll link below. And just a fantastic, another great record in his in his discography. Just he's consistently putting out good stuff, like probably 4 or 5 EPs every year, and I'm always impressed by his continuous quality, and nothing short of that here with the Terminus EP, which came out a couple weeks ago. All right, thanks for listening, and hopefully you'll check out more. And if you're interested in this artist, definitely check out his discography on Discogs. If you like the more analog, um, his earlier career, definitely check out his voice dealer work. Has some of my favorite work, and then a lot of great stuff under Silicon Scally and then Carl Finlow. But don't overestimate or overlook his music as random factors. But really great stuff there as well. And appreciate your time and watching and your support on the channel. All right, have a good rest of your day.
Electric cafe.